of the Sewalong, and when we're done, you will have a fantastic Meadowood to wear. A couple of things to go over before we start talking about buttonholes and buttons. This top, because it has such a wide open neck, you actually don't have to have functioning buttonholes. So for today, I am going to show you how to actually do all of the buttonholes and the buttons. But I will also show you how you can sew the buttons on without actually doing any buttonholes, which I do half and half. Some of my tops have buttonholes and some of them don't. This one definitely will have buttonholes, so I can show you guys how to do it, but it's completely up to you whether you do the buttonholes or not. I like the look of the buttonholes when they're sort of peeking out from behind the buttons, but it is totally up to you. Okay, so to start, you need to make sure you gather a few things. You obviously need to gather your buttons. You need 8. I don't even have 8 here. I'll have to track down one more. You're gonna need 8 buttons. They are 3/8 of an inch to 1/2 inch. These I believe are 1/2 inch, and they can be coordinating, they can be fun pops of color, whatever you would like. You just need 8 of them. So you need your buttonhole foot for your sewing machine. They usually look something like this. Go ahead and read your manual if you aren't familiar with doing buttonholes on your sewing machine, but this is the one that I have, and I have a Janome. It was the exact same foot for my brother that I previously had. So you need one of those. And then you definitely need some sort of marking tool. Again, I really like these friction pens and this Clover, I think it's called a Choco liner. So it does a really good chalk line on your garment. You also will need your button placement guide. So this is in the pattern. And we will use this. We used this for the interfacing, and now we will use it to mark the placement of the buttons on your top. The last thing that is good to have, it's not required, I really like it when we get to the button step, and that is some of this Elmer's glue. It's the kids' purple glue stick that dries clear, and it really holds those buttons in place when you're sewing them. I think I mentioned this before, but I actually have never read up on my machine how to sew buttons. I just put it in a zigzag, drop the stitch length down to as low as it will go, and then hold the button in place while it does sews it in place. I know that's probably not the proper way to do it, but that's the way I do it. So go ahead and read your manual for your machine as well to just confirm how to do buttons on your machine, and I will show you how I do mine. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. We will be putting the buttonholes on the wearer's right side. Okay, so men and women, the buttons on a buttoned up shirt are different from each other. So you can lay out your Meadowood like this. So you're gonna line up the buttonhole guide with your the edge of your top. The most important thing is to make sure that the top buttonhole is below the seam we created with the yoke and the front lower. There's a chance that if your hem was slightly off, or if you're sewing the yoke and the lower got off at all, it might look like your buttonhole is going to be over that seam. It is way too hard to try and sew a buttonhole over any sort of seam because there's so much fabric. So before you start marking anything and you lay it out, just make sure that that top buttonhole is below the seam we created with the yoke. So once that is in the correct place, I like to just take some pin or some, I like to take these clips and just hold the paper in place. You will be able to get the you know, more precise placement in terms of the alignment of the buttonhole. So if you mark it, we'll use this as an example. If I was to mark it and the mark ended up closer, not centered, you can always adjust that when you're going to actually do the buttonholes. So right now it's just making sure that we have the correct placement. Okay, so you can see here, the likelihood is that I probably got off a little bit. My paper hangs off a little. And so the most important thing, like I said, is to make sure that top buttonhole is right below the seam. Okay, so once you've kind of got it in place, you've got a couple of options. Let's just move that out of the way. So you can either, what do I want to say? So I mark the buttonholes lots of different ways. What I typically like to do, because of the way I put it into my sewing machine, is instead of trying to mark the entire length of the buttonhole, what I like to do is with a pin, and it can be anywhere, is I like to mark the bottom edge of the buttonhole. By knowing that your machine, or most machines, are gonna determine the size of the buttonhole from the button you've placed inside this buttonhole foot, I find it's easiest to just mark the bottom edge of the buttonhole, because then I will put it through the machine like this and just sew buttonhole after buttonhole after buttonhole. And so if I know where the first one starts, then I know as long as I do each buttonhole to start in the exact bottom edge, then they're all going to be even. So what you can do is go through and place a pin along that bottom edge. This is just sort of a temporary marker so that you know when we remove it that your lines are in the correct spot, or your marks. If you have a preferred way to mark your buttonholes, feel free to do that. I just like this process. So then, now that you know that you've got the bottom edge of each buttonhole marked, you can remove that guide, and with either your chalk or your friction pen, your fabric marker, you can make a line on the actual placket where that pin is. Once you've marked all of those bottom edges, you have two choices. You can either determine where the actual buttonhole will be placed. So let me explain that. So once you've got all of those marked, you can take out your pins, and I might use this so you guys can see it. Okay, so we have that entire line marked, and that marks the bottom edge of the buttonhole. So you can either figure out the center of this placket at the machine. I like to basically use this as a guide when it's in the machine, and just know, okay, as long as I line it up in the center, start here, then I'll just sew this way. If you're new to buttonholes, that might be a little nerve-wracking. So what you can do instead is either take your tape measurer or like this great little metal ruler, and find the center point. This looks like it's about 1.5 centimeters. And then you can just find the center point. So you know that's the center of the buttonhole. I tend to do it on the machine, but if you need to mark it like this, that's great as well. One other option is, let me show you, is you can actually cut through the paper like this. So we've cut it open, and then I'll just show you right here. And then when you lay it on your fabric, you can take your pin and it will draw a line through the paper onto the fabric. Any way you choose to mark those buttonholes will work, as long as you have some sort of reference point. So like I've got the bottom edge of each of these buttonholes is marked. And then I can just eyeball it on the machine and just make sure that I'm starting centered on the placket at the bottom of the buttonhole, and then the machine, based on my foot, will determine the length of the buttonhole that I need. Again, read your manual. All machines might operate differently. They might require buttonhole feet. Again, I have never used for actually attaching the button a specific foot, but this is the foot you have to have, or something along these lines, in order to do your buttonholes. Okay, so I know that doing buttonhole placement can be difficult. So if you're still confused, send me an email, send me a DM. I'm happy to explain it a little bit further. I did want to show you one tool that I bought years ago that I find is really helpful when I am doing buttonholes. And I did this on like the original version of this top that I sewed to determine how many buttons I wanted and how far apart. So it's this really cool, like, flexible ruler, basically, or gauge. I'm not sure what it's called. I'll make sure to link below. But basically, you determine, so I knew I wanted my first buttonhole to be right here, and I wanted my last buttonhole to be right there. So if you look at it, then what that does is it gives you perfectly spaced buttonholes. So a tool like this actually would be really helpful if you've shortened or lengthened your top, because it's going to affect the buttonholes. And so if you have shortened it, most likely you'll be removing a button. But if you've lengthened it and you want the same 8 buttons, we'll pretend like I've lengthened my top, 2 inches. What you can do if you have a tool like this, if you don't want to add another button, you would basically line it up with where you want your first button to go, and you want your second button to go there, and then it gives you equal distance between the buttons. So this is not required by any means. You can use the buttonhole guide, but if you are wanting a little more control in the future over other button patterns, if you want less buttons or more buttons, then this is a really great tool. So I will link this below. But we have now marked our buttonholes. Let's head over to the machine and I will show you how I get my fabric into my machine, how this buttonhole foot works, and we'll sew some buttonholes. we are going to cut the buttonholes open, which always feels really weird to be cutting open something that you just sewed, but I promise it will all work out. You are going to want to make sure that you have some fray check, and because we're cutting a woven fabric, the fray check will keep it from kind of becoming a bit of a mess. So go ahead and drip some fray check in the middle of your buttonholes. You don't have to do a lot, but just enough to protect that fabric from too much fraying. Now, when we're cutting open the buttonholes, there's some really cool tools. Buttonhole cutter, which I actually have, but I am worried that it got left in an Airbnb somewhere because I have not seen it since we moved into our house. So I'm going to show you guys the way that I always did it before I had a buttonhole cutter. So now, and I will say, if you don't have fray check, it's not the end of the world. Sometimes if I can't find it when I'm actually working on buttonholes, I just cut them open and hope for the best. So, like I said, I believe that my buttonhole cutter got left possibly in Airbnb, or it's hiding in one of the boxes that's still in my sewing room. And so I'm going to show you how I used to cut them. It's another great option when you're cutting buttonholes. You just have to be careful, because if you overcut, you end up cutting through sort of the outline of the buttonhole, and then that kind of defeats the purpose, because then it can fray further or beyond the buttonhole. So what I really like to do, and I'll just start here with one in the middle, is put a pin right at the edge of the buttonhole on both sides. Now, the reason I do that is because I am going to use a seam ripper, and if you're not careful, you can actually end up cutting beyond. So get your seam ripper, and what I typically will do is push the seam ripper in on one end, and then you can kind of get it started. It's usually the beginning that's kind of difficult. And then make sure you don't poke yourself, because I've poked myself before. Slowly cut down up to, but not through the end pieces. Okay? If after you've done that, you feel like you might need a little bit more space, get some thread snips, and you can go in there and get a little closer if you need it. But generally, buttonholes are designed to be the right, the right size for the button. If you have to sort of shove the button in, you might need to give yourself a little bit more space. So let me show you that again. You can put some pins in just to save yourself, because there's not much you can do if you slip with your seam ripper and cut open a huge hole. So again, you can don't poke yourself, push your seam ripper in, and then being careful not to poke yourself with the pins. Kind of work your way slowly, do it slowly down the length. Stop early if you need to, and come in with your thread snips and snip that last little bit. Okay, so let me show you another way you can do it. It's sort of starting the hole with the seam ripper and then finishing with thread snips. So instead of pushing your seam ripper through the buttonhole and just hoping that you're not gonna mess it up, what you can do is, let me trim this so it doesn't get in the way. What you can do is put it in, doesn't even have to be near the end, it can be right at the middle, and just get a tiny strip cut. So if if you can see. We just did a little section. And then go in with your thread snips and snip down the length. This is a little easier to do this method if your fabric is thinner. If you've got lots of layers of linen, this might be too difficult. I just find that I have way more control with thread snips than I do with a seam ripper, because all it takes is one misstep and you've now cut through your buttonhole. Whatever method you use is going to work. The key is you just need to open the buttonhole. So however you want to do it is fine. Just try to be really careful that you don't cut beyond the stitching on both ends. I'm going to do these last few and then we are going to talk buttons. With all of the buttonholes now cut open, we can use the buttonholes as a guide for the button placement. So the easiest way to do that is to lay out your top and line everything up. So you will be lining up the bottom hem and then line up the seam of the yoke. So try to really get that line straight across. It overlaps so that you've got it all lined up. You can use another clip here. This is really just, we're clipping these in place so that we can make sure we get everything lined up. Okay, now what I find is working my way down the shirt, I line up the inside edge of the buttonhole side with that sewn edge of the other placket. Now it gets a little trickier here because you can't really use clips. You can use pins. It doesn't matter if you pick up the back fabric because we're just using this to mark. Okay, so just line everything up. Apparently I was able to pattern match, which I didn't even try to do that. That just happened. And that it happened because I cut those front pieces on the fold. Like I laid them on the fold and then I cut. So that's how they lined up, but I did not even try to do that. Okay, so just make sure you line up that inside edge with the seam from behind. Just put as many pins as you need to hold everything in place. Okay, so we've got it all lined up. Now take your chalk or your marking pen and you're going to work down each button. What I like to do is open the buttonhole slightly and then in the center of that buttonhole make a mark. And then basically go down each buttonhole, open it up, find the center, and mark it. It doesn't have to be perfect, as long as it's in the right place. You may also, I can tell that's a dark color. So either your chalk or your marking pen, mark it in the center of each buttonhole. And then you can take all these pins out and we'll go ahead and just make sure that all of those marks are really visible from the right side of the fabric. And just make sure that they are, so there. Make sure they're centered. If you need to, use chalk. Sometimes I'll do, if I'm working with chalk, I'll do an X or a cross. So here's where your glue stick comes in handy. This really holds those buttons in place. So what I like to do is put a little bit of the glue on the back of the button locate that dot and line it up. Give it a little press and then just move on to the next one. You can use the iron to set it, to dry that glue, but I generally find I don't need it to last forever. I just need it to last as long as it takes for me to sew these buttons in place. So just move down the length of your top, centering them. So at each dot, if your dot is not quite centered, just make sure you center it on the button band. If you're wanting to skip the buttonholes, let me show you what we would do. So, and then we'll come back and I'll glue the rest of those on. So if you remember when we laid it out, we put the buttonholes on the wearer's right side. So if you are going to skip the buttonholes, try to think of it in terms of if your top was buttoned, which side would be on the top. So because we put buttons through the buttonhole, then that means this would be, this side, the wearer's right would be on the top. So if you are wanting to skip buttonholes, what you will do is line up just like we just did for the button placement. Line up the yoke seam and the bottom and the inside edge of the button placket on the wearer's right with the stitching line, the inside stitching line of the wearer's left. Now in this case, because you're going to be sewing with it pinned, you are going to want to make sure that you do not pin that back piece to it when you're pinning it in place. So I like to just put my hand inside the shirt and just make sure that I'm not pinning through the back. So once you have pinned the wearer's right side on top of the wearer's left side, remember this is if you are going to skip buttonholes and sew it closed with just buttons. Okay, so we'll pretend like these buttonholes aren't here. Okay, so once you've pinned it and you've got the two button plackets overlapped, you can take that same buttonhole guide and just like we did before, lay it so that that top buttonhole is down from that edge. And then centered on the buttonhole guide for that buttonhole, you will basically mark it and then place your button there. Use the glue stick, place your button, and then when you sew the button on, you will be sewing through both plackets. So you're sewing the shirt together without the buttonholes. So you'll sew that button right on there and then it looks like, without the buttonholes, that you have functional buttons. So it's really that easy. You basically are skipping the buttonhole step and then making sure that the wearer's right is on top of the wearer's left button placket. Pin it all together, glue your buttons in place, and then take it to your sewing machine and sew all those buttons, and then you're done. That's it. In this case, obviously, we have an additional step of doing the buttonholes, but like I said, I really like the look of the buttonholes, so it all depends on the look you're going for and your time. I'm pretty sure this one, yeah, I didn't even do buttonholes on this one. I just felt like doing the buttons and calling it a day. So if you have any questions about how you would do it without buttonholes, send me an email or a message, but the process is the same regardless of whether you do the buttonholes or not. You just skip the buttonhole part and move on to the buttons. So I am going to glue the rest of these buttons into place, and then we will take it to the sewing machine, sew on these buttons, and then your Meadowood is done. The buttons are all in place, and now I will take it over to my sewing machine, sew these buttons on, and then we're done. That's it. Once you have all of the buttons sewn on, all we need to do is secure all of these threads, and then that's it. So the easiest way, in this case I have a 4-hole button, which causes there to be a lot more strings. But you're essentially wanting to try to pull the thread through to the back. And sometimes this can be hard. In this case, because I sewed the first 2 holes and then the second hole's on top of it, it can make it a little more difficult, but you just pull on the thread a little and you can almost see the front string has now been pulled to the back. So just try, we've got one more, see if I can find it. Just try to pull it through. If you can't, it's not the end of the world. I sometimes am not able to get all of the strings through, and then it just might mean that you might have a loose button later. But in that case, we were able to pull all of the strings, you see here, all of the strings to the back, and then I typically will just split all of the strings because you have a lot, or I have a lot in this case since I sewed the 4 holes, and tie them all together, give it a couple of just quick knots, and then you will trim and you're done. That's it. That's how you secure the tail threads of your button. This is also a great chance if you are into hand sewing buttons. You could sit down with a show and hand sew all of these 8 buttons on. But whether you choose to hand sew or use a machine, it's totally up to you. But believe it or not, that was the last step. You now have a completely finished Meadowood, and I'm so excited to see all of your versions. And again, if you have any questions, let me know, send me an email, a DM on Instagram, whatever is easiest for you, or comment below, and I will hopefully have answers for you. I hope you enjoyed this sew along, and I really look forward to sharing more with you in the future.